Hello and welcome to Star Trek Sundays. Today's episode is Parenting, in which we'll discuss how parenting was presented and contemplated through Star Trek. The recording of this episode will be published in 2 parts. In this part, we will discuss the episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, The Child. Next week, we'll discuss New Ground, another TNG episode. In today's episode of the podcast, some of the crew discuss situations that involve childhood injury as well as a death in the community. It's raw and it's real. If you're new here, I'm Victoria, and with me is my co-host T. Star Trek Sundays is a podcast through which we and our guest crew examine the philosophical themes presented in Star Trek every Sunday at 10 a.m. PST on Clubhouse. Our goal is not to come to conclusions on the themes we discuss, but to spark contemplation and conversation, which we hope continues after the live recording and into the lives of the listeners of the podcast. For more information about Star Trek Sundays, please visit our website at StarTrekSundays.com. There you'll find links to our published podcasts, links to our recording schedule and watch lists, and our Star Trek Sundays trading post, which showcases some of our fan art. The Star Trek Sundays podcast is available 1 week after the live show on YouTube and podcast platforms. Please consider subscribing. T, what a great set of Star Trek TNG episodes you curated for us this week. Can you tell us how Star Trek treated the topic of parenting, and then we'll get into The Child?
You bet, and thank you, Victoria. Star Trek definitely took a bit of a different approach to parenting and families. Most of the time when dealing with the military, families don't get deployed with the soldiers. Now, the NCC 1701-D is not a wartime ship. It's the Federation flagship, and its mission is diplomatic relations and exploration. So while it's inarguable that the Enterprise is a deadly vehicle in battle, the presence of families of crew aboard is actually a feature that humans have strived to achieve and enjoy at their leisure during peacetime and forego during times of war. It's with this situational backdrop that we find ourselves in space flying around with a bunch of families on board, and naturally, this leads to parental challenges. But what I think is interesting about the way Star Trek handled it is they didn't really want to change the nature of parenting. They only wanted to change the situation it occurs in. In many ways, these episodes felt like love letters to parents, writers who had gone through this many, many, many times and knew it would make for a good story because parenting is a challenge. From mothers who decide that they are going to give birth to their child, to fathers who want to believe their child but realize they are lying to them. These don't necessarily feel like science fiction themes, and yet, when taking place on the Enterprise, they take on a whole new life of their own. Perhaps it's Star Trek's commitment to exploring humanity that made these feel so natural, because I didn't question why we were telling these stories at all. In a world full of unknowns, parenting is another opportunity to seek out and explore new life forms. And so I'm excited today to do a trek of our own on parenting.
Thanks, T. Yeah, new life forms, indeed. Some parents might even consider their children little aliens at times. So let's start with The Child. Can you provide a summary of the episode to remind those who didn't get a chance to review it what the story was about? And then I have a question for you.
Definitely. The Child, Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 2, Episode 1, first aired on the 21st of November, 1988. In this episode, Deanna finds herself unexpectedly pregnant and is faced with the decision of keeping this baby of unknown origins, who grows rapidly through all the stages of human development. I chose this episode because it really puts the decision to become a parent in highlight to a number of interesting situations where hard parenting choices had to be made in unknown circumstances.
Thank you, T. I'm going to set aside for a moment Riker's facial expressions and reactions about Deanna's pregnancy, as well as Dr. Pulowski's terrible treatment of Data. We can dig into those later if there's time. This episode contained so much to consider. From Deanna listening to her co-workers talking about whether or not the child should be born, in front of her but as if she wasn't there, until she stated firmly that she would indeed be having the child, to the pain of losing a child. While the explanation for the child coming into Deanna's life gave her some comfort about the loss, the scene in which she loses her child was still gutting to watch. Deanna was determined to be a parent despite not having a clue as to how she got pregnant or what sort of child she would have. This is science fiction, but it's not that much different from real life. Parents have it hard because the decision to be a parent means taking on the unknown and putting on a brave face. Can you think of a time when you either had a scare as a parent or gave a parent a scare when you were a child?
Yeah, there was a scene that my parents would always remind me of growing up when I was 3 years old. I was over at my grandmother's house, and she had a low wall. And when I say low, I mean like knee high. It was a concrete wall with bricks on top of it. And we were in the backyard out on the patio, and I had seen a butterfly. And immediately, like my first reaction is, butterfly. And I start running at full steam towards this butterfly and smack my head directly into the wall, knock myself out cold, am now sitting there, laying there bleeding on the floor with a big gash in my forehead. So they rushed me to the doctor. I think I woke up. I remember waking up in the car, and I remember being very confused. And they were, I mean, they just had, they had your typical parent panic scare situation where now, their child has, number one, is now bleeding all over the place and you're rushing them to the emergency room. And number two, is now having like confusion due to head trauma. I ended up being fine and, was in the hospital for a day and they let me go the next day. But it was one of those situations where my parents would remind me of that and just how like terrifying it was, how scary it was. And growing up, I think I was always a little bit more cautious because I didn't want to scare my parents in that way. I didn't want to give them, that big jolt of like, their son being hurt or something. And so I always played it a little bit safer after that. Even during my tree climbing phase, I would always be very careful and very cautious, and I would always make sure that my parents like, knew where I was at and could, come help me if I needed it or something. And it was one of those things where going into being a parent, I knew that I was going to equally have to face these types of situations, these types of scares. And I just got incredibly fortunate that like I don't think I ever had my son was certainly sick, but he was never injured in any meaningful way. And so I got really fortunate in that regard. Is I didn't have to go through nearly, I think, the same scares that I put my parents through by virtue of me being a child. But I am reminded of like, Deanna's decision at this point to sort of go, yeah, I'm going to be a parent, and my own decision to go, yeah, I'm going to be a parent and accept that, man, there's going to be some scares coming up by virtue of the fact that they're just children and they're little sacks of potatoes that you can throw around and they bounce and get back up and hopefully keep, wandering around, right? So the episode really resonated with me in that way because I, as a parent and as a child, remember the scares of parenting.
Wow, yeah. I can imagine how scary that is when, I never thought about it as a kid, about how scared the parents would be. But now as an adult, when I see little kids doing something, I can't even imagine how scary that would be to see a little 3-year-old hitting their head and passing out. That would be really scary. So thank you for sharing that. Thanks for coming up to the stage, Babs. How are you today?
Definitely glad to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Oh, great, great. Well, I'll put this question to you, and welcome to the stage, Ryan. So, Babs, as you know, parents have it hard because the decision to be a parent means taking on the unknown and putting on a brave face. Can you think of a time when you either had a scare as a parent or gave some parents a scare by being a child?
Absolutely. The fact that I even became pregnant was a scare. I was told by 6 different doctors that I would never get pregnant. I had underlying health conditions and different things that would lead to me being infertile. And from the time I was 16 to the time I was 27, I was under the belief that I would never get pregnant, thanks to all of these doctors. and I woke up one morning and I was like, I think I'm pregnant, weirdly enough. And I'd never thought like that before. And I brought it up to my ex-husband, and I was like, "I think I'm pregnant." And there was excitement, and yeah, there was a consideration of whether or not I would get an abortion. I chose not to do that. I knew that, or I thought that I would be a good parent, and I think I am a good parent. But yeah, I think just the overall, just I think it's so common that women don't think they're gonna get pregnant or have been told that they're not gonna get pregnant, and then they find out they are, at whatever stage they do. I think that alone is scary. And then to find out, X amount of weeks into the pregnancy, where everything has to be rushed, right? Because I didn't find out until I was about, I think I was about 8 weeks pregnant, 9 weeks pregnant, 10 weeks pregnant. And most women, I guess I found out I guess they find out really soon, sooner than that. So, I guess I was a little late to the party. But, I guess it depends from woman to woman, but I think, for the most part, just finding out that you're pregnant in general is just a huge scare. But then I think you ease into it. I eased into it pretty easily. And I love being a parent. I love the struggles, the excitement, the peril, if you will, of the scary situations. So I don't ever want a scary situation for my child, but when it does happen, I'm here to be the brave face for him. So I love being a parent, and as scary as it was finding out that I was pregnant, I could never take it back. I love being a parent. So.
I appreciate that a lot, Babs. You know, biologically speaking, there's really nothing complicated about pregnancy except everything, right? It's dangerous. It's
Mhm.
potentially a very, very serious medical situation, even in a normal
Oh,
pregnancy.
absolutely.
And then you add on additional complications, and it's like, oh, that makes things even scarier. And so I'm glad that you are here and got to share that story with us, because I remember scares with past exes, with who also thought that they were infertile from as many doctors as you have spoken to other complications, and then got pregnant, and then the only option was an abortion, and that's the route that we sort of had to go down with the doctors, and it was a crap route. And so I'm so glad that you're here to tell the story, and thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. And surprisingly enough, my pregnancy went so well that my doctor couldn't deliver my pregnancy, and the stand-in doctor, the on-call doctor came in and he goes, "It's really weird." He's like, "I've never met a patient who's had such a clean-cut pregnancy." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm like, it's kind of weird." I'm like, I no complications, no nothing. And you know, I it was an incredible experience, and I know not all women were as lucky as I was, or are as lucky as I was to be as healthy as I was during my pregnancy.
Well, thank you for that, Babs. While you were telling the story, it occurred to me, a lot of women anticipate that they will be able to get pregnant, and sometimes they even take lots of steps not to get pregnant until they're ready. And in that time, it's given them lots of space to think about what kind of a parent they'll be, and maybe even prepare as much as one could prepare for such a job. And I'm wondering, since it was a surprise for you, since you didn't think you were going to get pregnant, and so perhaps didn't prepare in the same way, when you found out you were pregnant, was there anything that you did differently to prepare for parenthood? Like just your mind shift of what to expect? Or did you just go in going, well, no parent knows and we just do our best? So what did you think at that time when you realized, oh, I'm going to be a mom?
I think for me, the biggest thing was, and if there's any background noise, I apologize. Kiddo just came in the room. I think the biggest thing for me was I think there's just a general shift of mind as a mother when you start carrying the child, right? And, every woman's motherly instinct can vary. I do feel that that's on a spectrum, but I feel that there's just a general shift that happens in the mindset of a woman when they find out that they're pregnant. Just that, okay, I need to take responsibility and I need to do this, I need to do that. The driving force behind my parenting, honestly, is to not be the way my mother was. There was a lot of restrictions, there was a lot of boundaries that were crossed and things like that. Hang on one second. There were a lot of boundaries that were crossed and things like that. So my biggest driving force as a parent is to not parent the way that I was parented. Just to, you know, be there emotionally, be there, mentally as a parent versus just being there physically and financially.
Great. Thank you for that. We always love hearing kiddo in the background. So, welcome, Ryan. Haven't seen you in a while. It's good to see you. And I said at the beginning, where's Ryan? Because he brings up parenting all the time in these shows. So, I'm really happy that you were able to make it. So, as we said, parents have it hard because the decision to be a parent means taking on the unknown and putting on a brave face. Can you think of a time when you either had a scare as a parent or gave some parents a scare when you were a child?
Good morning. Yeah, most definitely. I mean, early on in my daughter's life, we found out that she had a bunch of allergies. The one of the scariest moments for me was coming home from doing some work, and this is when we were living with my in-laws. Coming home to my mother-in-law being like, "Everything is okay, but your daughter's having an allergic reaction to something we fed her." And I go, "Okay, well, let's see the situation." And my 1 year old is has blotchy rashes everywhere. Her eyes are yellow and they're rolling back into her skull. And I'm kind of freaking the fuck out, right? But I have to put on the grown up face. And they say, well, we gave her some medication, some allergy medication. She should be okay. I'm like, no, she's not okay. We need to give her her EpiPen. And the situation stalls a little bit, but then she starts throwing up and evacuating her bowels at the same time, and like everything that's in her comes out. And so I call the nurses line and they say, yeah, give her her EpiPen. We give her her EpiPen. We call the ambulance, and as she's being wheeled out into the ambulance, my wife shows up from her job, and it was a scary situation because especially when you want your kid, right? Because I had the desire to have children since I was very young. I've always been a caretaker in my family. I took care of my grandmother when she was ill. I took care of my siblings when they were young, and so there was always this expectation of I'll have kids. And here's the first moment where that assumption is really being put into peril because she could have died. And the whole time I have to keep a level head, right? So I'm not allowed to freak out. And we get her to the hospital, and everything's fine, and everything works out. But that's the first real moment that you go, yes, this life is so fragile, and I have to do everything to keep her alive until she can keep herself alive. And even then, I had a scare. I had a health scare a few weeks ago, and my mother came up from Mexico to be with me to make sure that her firstborn was okay. And so that instinct, that desire to want to make our kids' lives better never goes away. And obviously there's a whole spectrum of parenting, right? Like there's parents that probably shouldn't have been parents, that are a little too psychopathic. And then there's parents that guard and spoil too much, making their child's life difficult later on. But for the most part, I think that as parents, want our children to be successes, want our children to get to the finish line of being able to take care of themselves. And it's something that you're never going to stop worrying about, because you made something amazing, right? With that person, with your partner, you made something that seems like magic, that seems like shouldn't be possible, but it is. And there they are, these independent people with their own personalities, their own wants and desires, and their own attitudes. And it's not for everybody, but for those that are willing to take on the challenge, it is quite an experience.
Yeah, thank you. I see babies all the time, and I have to look at them because I think, wow, a new person. And then I look at the parent and I just go, oh my God, what a job. It's absolutely incredible what you parents take on. And you're right, it never ends. You know, I lived with my grandmother for many years into her late 80s. And when one of her kids, who would have been in their 60s, had something going on, she was still just as mother bear as ever. Even though she was a great grandmother, she was still, she was still that mom. And her kids took priority over her grandkids and her great grandkids. The other people could take care of them, but her kids were still her kids. So you're right, it never goes away. T, did you have any thoughts on that before we move to Joshua?
Yeah, it occurs to me that we are so fortunate to live in the time that we do live in, where we know about things like EpiPens and other things like that. And I'm reminded of that scene from what was it, Star Trek 4? Yeah, it was Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, in which Bones is, treating the old lady and says, she's describing what they want to do to her, and he says it's barbaric, right? And he gives her a pill, and then she's cured of whatever the problem was. And I so look forward to the day when we have such miracle cures. And I'm so fortunate, to live in a day and age when we have the miracle cures that we have today. Because I certainly do sleep a lot better at night knowing that that technology is available to us. And I'm glad that, it was available to you at a time when you needed it too. So that story worked out well.
Thanks, T. Well, welcome to the stage, Joshua. It's nice to see you. I hope you're ready for this one. Maybe you've got some stories to share. So, as we've said before, parents have it hard because the decision to be a parent means taking on the unknown and putting on a brave face. Can you think of a time when you either had a scare as a parent or guardian, or gave some parent a scare when you were being a child?
I know that I gave my mother quite a number of scares. My mother was away getting another guide dog when I was alone home. And she's like, okay, this is risky, but I'm going to let you stay home. So I was home by myself for 2 weeks while she went up to guide dog school when I was a sophomore. And, I had family checking in on me, but I was alone by myself for a lot. She had to find out that I had gone to the hospital because I was probably going to lose my eyesight while she couldn't come home to do anything about it. So, and she was she also knew how difficult that was because she was blind herself. So that probably wasn't the greatest thing for her. I mean, she knew I was going through something. She knew I was going through all the same challenges that, different, right? Mine was much more sudden than hers in terms of the final end of it. But yeah, she was not exactly happy, and not exactly happy that I wanted to go to my friend's birthday party the next day while I was essentially nearly blind for like a day. So it was that's the only thing I can think of. I ultimately, she, kind of helped me through the transition and everything. And it was positive, relevant to her as my mother, me as her son, our relationship with each other. But I don't think she was particularly happy that I took so many risks and made the choices I did while she wasn't there. So, I don't know how exciting that is or relevant to the discussion it is because I just came in partway through, but that's the first thing I thought of since you asked.
Thanks, Joshua. We were talking about the child, where Deanna chooses to be pregnant and have a child despite not knowing even how she got pregnant or what the child would be, right? Turns out it was humanoid of sorts, or at least took that form. So, the conversation is just the hardships of parenting and some of those surprises. And I imagine that was probably one of the most difficult times of your mom's life. But given how active you are even now, she she must have gone through some sort of phase in her life to accept that to love you is also to love the risks you take. So I wonder, have you guys ever talked about that? Because you still take risks,
Yeah,
and I'm wondering how she deals with that.
it's really funny because she knows. Sometimes I tell her what I've done after I've done it. I don't tell her all the things I'm going to do because I don't want her to worry. Like I think it was last year. I want to say it was 2022. The years kind of blur together, but there was the volcano eruption that was undersea volcano eruption that affected like Tonga really horribly, and some of the South Pacific islands and stuff. I don't know if anybody remembers. And in Northern California, it really like severely affected like the flooding of my hometown. I grew up in Santa Cruz, up in Northern California, and it was all crazy and everything. And that was the same day I had a surf contest locally. And locally it was challenging, but it wasn't anywhere near as dangerous. But I got to say I surfed in a tsunami, and I get a text from my mother going, "You're not going anywhere near the ocean, are you?" And it wasn't until after so I was like, okay, note to self, don't talk to mom until after my heat's over. And so after, not before, but after I had surfed in those waters, which honestly really weren't that bad for Southern California as compared with the other places. It was only after that I told her that I had actually had a surf contest the same morning that she was so worried that I was going to be anywhere near the ocean because it's like a mom. She's expecting a big tidal wave to take out anything close to shore. Not even remotely the type of conditions we had down here, other than really strong currents. So, yeah, I take it a point to tell her about this stuff afterwards because she'll worry otherwise.
How kind. Well, I think I hope that there are times where she really enjoys that you have embraced life
She
so
does.
fully
Like it's all
and are
positive.
so
She's not a
active.
worry
Yeah.
wart all the time, and
Yeah.
it's all generally positive. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Welcome to the stage, Boat. I know you just got into the room, so I'll just catch you up. We were just talking about an episode called The Child, where Deanna, the counselor on the Enterprise, becomes mysteriously pregnant and decides to keep the child and just see what happens. Her pregnancy is rapid. It's within 36 hours. And when she has the child grows up quite quickly as well. I think he becomes 8 years old within a few days. Through that episode, we came to the conclusion that parents have it hard because the decision to be a parent means taking on the unknown and putting on a brave face. So I'm wondering, can you think of a time when you either had a scare as a parent or gave some parents a scare when you were a child?
Well, thanks for having me on stage, first of all, and second, good morning, everybody. Let's see. Well, first and third, I mean, the theist must really love that episode. Did we find out how she got pregnant?
We do. It was an energy force. And we can go into the fact that it was not consensual later if you want.
Uh-oh.
Oh no.
But I hadn't really thought about the whole theist thing, so that's a good take.
Yeah,
Thank you
it
for
is.
that.
Yeah, I mean, holy cow. So let's see if been scared as a parent. Yeah, okay, so moments I've been scared as a parent. I'm a step parent, actually, only. I became a step parent when my stepdaughter was 4. So I think the answer to the question of being afraid as a parent that the answer is constantly, which is I'm sure true of every parent, but especially so because I didn't have like 4 years to warm up. I was like, what happens when they get near the corner of a street? Like, there's been we got a lot of catching up to do in terms of like trust and like getting her to understand that I have to keep her safe. why should she think I would ever do such a thing? So like that was an added like kind of that was something. I think that's an added component to step parenting, perhaps. And then scaring my parent. I really would have terrified my mother if she knew pretty much anything about all of my behavior from about 13 to 25. And so I'm just telling her things now, I think, just to like for fun, like when we talk. But I was terrifying. I was a terrifying child. And I think maybe that helped me, and a terrifying teenager and young adult. So I think that actually helped me be a parent because I'm actually pretty lucky to be alive, frankly. And I could point to a lot of really kind of concrete cases where that is so. And I'm sure some people can relate to that. So I think when becoming a step parent, I was like, without like revealing a bunch of glory days, I think I was very conscious of that fact and would just try and in raising my stepdaughter, talk with her about like the dark corners of the world and why one would venture into those places or not. And I think that really helped give my stepdaughter, at least so she says, a perspective as she got older and wanted to kind of explore what like life had to offer.
That's great. And I love the added value that you bring as a step parent, because I think that the next episode that we talked about, where Worf's son comes to live with him at a young age of 6 or something like that, 6 or 7, but having lived with his grandparents, Worf is basically a new dad to a child, not a toddler, not a baby. So perhaps you will some of that will resonate with you. T, before we move on to the break where we talk about what's upcoming, did you have anything further to say on this topic?
Yeah, parenting, step parenting, same thing. It's all the overlap on that is a big circle. Just wanted to point that out, right?
Oh, absolutely. For responsibility, for sure. I just thought it was interesting that Boat will come in kind of around the same time that Worf started coming in as a parent. So I was relating it to that for sure.
I agree. I will say that I have some, like, I think there are some key differences that, you know, I will bend the ear of any new step parent about, which I think you're right, T. I think it all adds up in the end to be the same because it's about love and trust, right? Mostly. And being, when you can, a guiding human being on the planet for the young person who is your child, whether it's your natural child or stepchild. But there are some like interesting key differences, I think, as well that shouldn't be taken for granted because there's just this desire on the part of people who might be step parents to like feel like they have to be their father or have to be, people say to me, oh, well, she's been with you since you were 4, since she was 4. So she's really your daughter. And I'm like, nope, she's not. She has a father and whatever the flaws or whatever character of that father, he still exists in the world. I am not that person. I'm somebody else who has gained her love and trust independent of that and don't need to be her father in the way people think of it. And I think kind of, trying to create that relationship is very, very important. And because I think people do feel a need to be like, oh, well, I want to be a replacement. I want to be the thing that they, I want to be the mother or the father because the mother and father have kind of gone out of the situation. And I'm like that. I would always say I would advise people that that's not a good idea. So that you have to forge your own kind of relationship, which is in a way the same, and in a way very different.
Oh, that's definitely true. I just think that it works best when the village raises the child and everybody sort of like shares the role of parenting around a little bit. And I'm just reminded of the ending scene of this episode where Picard is saying, who's going to tuck Wesley in at night, and Worf says, I'll do that. I'll take on that responsibility. So it's just, I thought that was like such a touching moment to sort of remember that, anytime that you're interacting with a child, you might be doing a little bit of parenting, even if you're not taking on like the role of a parent or a step parent or something like that. Right.
Well, speaking of, Jonas, She's 27 now. So if anybody, anyone feels like being a village parent, reach out to her. Happy. I think you guys are right. You guys would all be great influences and mentors for her. So, feel free to reach out.
We'll do that.
Yeah, great contributions, everyone. That's wonderful. Welcome to the stage, Gela. I'd love to put this question to you. As you know, parents have it hard because the decision to be a parent means taking on the unknown and putting on a brave face. Can you think of a time when you either had a scare as a parent or gave some parents a scare when you were a child?
This is not a situation where my own child gave me a scare, but I certainly was scared as a parent. When my daughter was about 6 months old, I walked into synagogue one Saturday morning, and there was this heaviness in the air. And my sister came over to me and said, Senesh didn't wake up this morning. Senesh was the niece of one of our members. And this 13-year-old girl, who we all knew, um, had woken up dead, essentially. She just, they couldn't wake her up in the morning, and nobody knew what had happened. And there I am with a 6-month-old, and all of a sudden, I'm in a world where a child can just not wake up one morning. A 13-year-old. We talk about sudden infant death syndrome, and there's all these things that we worry about as parents of newborns, but like, here I am all of a sudden in a world where, oh my God, that worry is potentially never going to go away, because if this can happen, then what how do I parent? Knowing that this is a thing that happens. It turned out that she had, for some reason, or maybe for no reason, taken one of her father's antidepressants, and the dosage was not appropriate for her, and it had killed her in her sleep. So I went out and I bought a locking case for all of my pills, and as soon as Batya was old enough to understand, I told her, Batya, these are mommy's pills. You are never, ever, 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 ever to even touch them or go near them. And if you ever find something around that looks like a pill or a candy or anything, don't touch it. Tell mommy right away. And then when she was a little older, I mean, one might think that she's not old enough now to be told this, but I did tell her that I am so emphatic with her about not touching mommy's pills because a child from Antidina Synagogue died from taking her parents' pills. And she looked at me and she said, I will never, ever, ever touch your pills, mommy. Good girl, and gave her a big hug. Yeah, that's one of the things about parenting is encountering fears that you never even conceived of before you became a parent. Like, things you didn't know that you had to worry about all of a sudden are looming up at you, and the world all of a sudden seems like a very, very dangerous place. And eventually we all learn to cope with that, because parenting is to some extent a slog, and you come to learn that children are resilient. They're largely made of rubber. They bounce back very easily from a lot of things, but especially in those early days, it is absolutely terrifying to be a parent.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Gela. I'm sorry for the family and their loss, and I imagine that would have been terrifying. And I often wonder, I'm child free. I chose not to have kids, and part of that was I just didn't understand how a parent could wrap their head around sending their kid off to school. Like, it's such a precious thing in your life, and I just don't know, I didn't know how I would be able to cope with the worry about it. I knew how I felt about my pets, and I knew that having a child, whether it was a stepchild or adopted child or my own child, biologically, I knew that it would be 1,000 times the worry. And so I appreciate you guys sharing the realities of that and how scary it can be, even when it's not your own at that time, and the empathy that parents feel for each other. T, did you have anything to add right now?
Yeah, I definitely did want to say thank you, Gala, for that, because I remember when my son had a friend of his fall through the ice and die, and you know, having to ask him, do you know what that means, that they died, and sort of have that discussion about not being able to come around to play anymore because they're not alive anymore, and what that really meant. And as much as we want to shelter our children from such realities, we don't want to expose them to things like grisly death and loss and stuff like that. We can't. And it sucks because we then have to go sit down with them and say, look, this is what happens. This is the reality of the situation. You could die just like this other person did. And this is horrible. And it's something that as parents, we sort of have to go through with our children, is sitting them down and explaining the realities of the world that we live in, and just how dangerous it is. And how difficult that is to just to want to fill it with gummy bears and Skittles and rainbows, and not show them these things, and then to realize that would actually not that help them at all. It would hurt them to not better understand, even at an early age, just what the world is actually like and what they have to, cope with, like pills and things like that.
Absolutely. I wanted to bounce off, and like I've had to explain death to my son when he was 2. On a smaller scale, our pet cat Scooter had passed away. And Scooter would sleep with us every night, and he'd listen to Stairway to Heaven with us, and lay on Connor's chest. And so when he died, I had to explain to Connor just exactly what was happening. And I had to explain it, of course, in the sense in the manner in which a 2-year-old would understand, right? So I didn't explain the whole process, but I said, well, he's going to sleep and he's not going to come back. He can't play with us anymore. And my son, actually, surprisingly, I feel like kids cope with death much easier. And yes, maybe it's the idea that they're a child, right, and they're innocent and they don't really understand. But even now, at 4 years old, almost 5, my son remembers Scooter very vividly, and he'll be like, "Is Scooter gonna come sleep with us tonight?" And I say, "No, he can't, baby. You remember, Scooter's sleeping right now." And he's like, "Oh, that's right. I miss Scooter a lot." And I'm like, "Me too, baby." And then he moves on. And I think kids are so resilient in that manner, as long as it's explained to them in a reasonable fashion. I think kids are very resilient when it comes to grieving and loss.
As I said, I'm not a parent, but I look after a lot of my friends' kids over the years, from the time they were babies up until, they could take care of themselves as teenagers. And I do remember this one time where one of my friends' kids, she was 6. And I always believed that as long as I was honest with the kids, um, then it would be fine, because kids just, they want honesty. And sometimes they don't get it from their parents and their grandparents, and so I'm not gonna disclose something that might be of opinion, but I can talk around some things in an honest way. Anyway, my girlfriend's daughter was 6, and we used to, make videos of her dancing and, play games, and I would write down stories that she would dictate. So we always had a lot of activity going on. And I remember this one day she came up and she stood in front of me, and I said, "Yeah, what is it?" And she says, "What happens when we die?" And she was so
Oh, no.
serious. And I thought, what the deuce? What am I going to do with this? And I said, well, we know a little bit about how we die and what can be done with our bodies afterwards, but we don't really know what happens after. Why? And I wasn't sure what her parents had told her or anything. And I knew they weren't religious, but I wasn't sure if they had, sometimes we tell kids things like Santa and stuff. So I don't know if heaven and hell had been talked about or not. And certainly I wasn't going to talk about it. So I said, we don't know. And as it turns out, she wanted to talk about her older sister. So about a year or two before she was born, my friend had a daughter that died shortly after birth, and they had a little picture of her. And so they would talk about her to this daughter, their second daughter. And so she was aware of this, but she was aware that she's now older than when her older sister died as a baby, right? So I can understand why that would be a bit confusing to her. And she had also experienced a dog of theirs, a pet, dying as well. And as it turned out, I said, we don't really know. But as I understand it, we don't really feel anything after, right? It's sort of like if we go to sleep and we don't dream. So, I was worried that she would be in pain or something like this. And as it turned out, she was just worried that her parents were going to die, because she says, I don't want my parents to die. I want to live with them forever. And I said, oh, that's, a long time away. I mean, everybody does die, but it is a long time away. And you might actually move out of the house before that happens. And that scared her more than anything else. She's like, what? Move out of the house? I'm never moving out of the house. And as it turns out, she's in her mid-20s now and hasn't moved out of the house. But that's normal for the Gen Z. But anyway, it was a really beautiful conversation about it. And we got to some issues that she hadn't really explored with her parents. And I guess she trusted me, and it was just a moment where she was inspired to say something. Of course, though, when her parents got home, I was like, look, we got to talk, right? Because this is what your kid asked me. This is what I said, because I didn't want her to then have a conversation with them, repeating something that I had said without giving it context, and them thinking, where the hell did she get this information, right? But they get curious about those things. So I think it's probably a good idea to talk about it and not make it something so mysterious. So anyway, that's my little talk on it. And that wraps this first part of parenting. Thank you for listening to Star Trek Sundays. Today we discussed parenting through the lens of the next generation's The Child. Next week we'll publish the second half of this podcast, in which we discuss the next generation's New Ground, when Worf becomes a full-time and somewhat naive dad. We are returning to the live recording on April 2nd with our episode For the Love of Trek, an homage to Star Trek, when we'll be discussing 2 non-Trek TV shows, A Happy Refrain from The Orville and USS Callister from Black Mirror. Please consider joining us on Clubhouse for the live chat, and we hope you have a great week ahead.